just a moment. It's been quite a morning. Seems like everything that could go wrong today could go wrong. I learned that tying a bow tie is not like riding a bicycle. You forget how, and you have to watch YouTube tutorials to figure it out again. And I also learned that you can cut your nose while shaving if you're in a hurry. And to be more careful while riding down the interstate. I hit some carcass and had to stop to examine my undercarriage of my vehicle that I'm hoping is okay. So that's why I was running a bit late. So please forgive me. The power of pride. On a cold evening in Charleston in 2006, walking back to my car after leaving class at College of Charleston, I found myself taking a right turn off King Street onto Ann Street. Then furtively, as if I were a fugitive seeking refuge, I ducked into Dudley's bar. This was not the first time I had entered a bar, a gay bar nonetheless. While visiting New York City a month prior, and I had my first ever alcoholic beverage at a bar in Greenwich Village. But this was different. This wasn't a strange city. This was close to home. This was risky. I sat down at the bar amidst a small happy hour crowd and ordered the same drink I ordered in New York City. When the New York bartender asked me what I was having, I realized I had never ordered a drink before. So I said the only drink I knew of, what I had learned from reruns of Sex and the City. Cosmo, please, I said. I was delighted to learn that a Cosmopolitan in Charleston was only 1/3 of the price I had paid in New York City. But being new to drinking, I sipped slowly and sat nervously, observing others in the room, but speaking to no one. After a short time, however, a tall, well-dressed older gentleman noticed my awkward isolation and introduced himself to me. "I'm Richard," he said, "but everyone calls me Donna." Donna introduced me to everyone in the room, and in no time I felt like Norm in Cheers, right at home. And over the next hour or two, Donna relayed to me the story of his name. Growing up in Charleston in the late 60s and 70s, Richard was always somewhat of an outcast. Though he tried his best to hide who he was always a naturally flamboyant character who just didn't fit into a closet. As a young adult, he learned how dangerous it was to be himself. One day, as he was merely walking down a city street, a group of young men began to heckle him with homophobic slurs, and then they attacked and brutally beat him. And so, because being his true self made him a target, and since he could not convincingly play the role, the stereotypical part, of a straight man in order to blend in, Richard invented Donna. "If I couldn't be a straight man," he explained, "I figured I'd be a straight woman." Donna was able to go into bars and restaurants, go shopping, and even ride the city bus without fear of homophobic attacks. Although being perceived as a woman carried with it its own risk of violence, it was safer for him to be a straight woman than a gay man. And so for several years, Donna was a well-known Charlestonian. But eventually, Richard grew tired of living in isolation and found the courage to come out of the closet, and in doing so, put Donna's hair, makeup, clothing, and jewelry in the closet. "She was fabulous," Richard told me, "but I didn't need her anymore." Richard's, or Donna's, story, I believe, exemplifies what we celebrate during Pride Month. Pride is not only about having the courage to be oneself, but also about acknowledging the struggle it took to get there. Pride, first of all, is protest. When we think of pride today, we tend to think of celebration. I went into a Belk department store Friday afternoon and noticed on the door they had written Belk in rainbow colors. As I stepped onto the escalator, I noticed a section of pride merchandise, t-shirts, hats, shoes, even a rainbow flag doormat, if for some reason you want to wipe your feet with a symbol of the movement you support. While I'm somewhat bothered by the capitalistic exploitation of pride, I'm also encouraged that there are enough people who celebrate pride that it's created a market for corporations to exploit. But if we could go back in time to June 28, 1969 on Christopher Street in New York City, we would find the first Pride was less a protest or less a parade and more a protest. Just 1 year earlier, police raided a popular gay club in Greenwich Village known as the Stonewall Inn. This was by no means the first time this had occurred. Throughout the 60s and previous decades, police frequently raided gay establishments, which at a time when citizens could be arrested or lose their job for being openly gay was the only place of refuge for the LGBTQ community to be openly public. No one really knows what was different about this particular raid. Some have suggested the mistake the police made was to raid the bar on the night after Judy Garland's funeral. And you don't mess with the LGBTQ community when we have just laid to rest one of our icons. I can't speak for anyone else, but if, God forbid, Diana Ross is not the immortal deity, which I believe she is, on the day of her interment, I will be an emotionally volatile wreck. Nevertheless, regardless of the reason, on this particular day, the LGBTQ community in New York City had had enough. The police may have thought this was just another raid of another gay bar, but what they did not realize is with every raid, every arrest, every beating and humiliating search, something was building within the LGBTQ community. And that something is what we call pride. Pride is, first of all, protest. It is a determination to stand up for ourselves and stand against those who would oppress us. Pride that day swelled up within patrons of the Stonewall Bar who fought back against the police. Pride swelled up as onlookers witnessed a police officer hit a lesbian woman over the head, forcing her into a van. Pride overflowed as hundreds of people stood up and fought back, leading to an uprising that continued for 5 days, galvanizing the LGBTQ community. And 1 year later, that same spirit of pride was on display as marchers took to the streets, not as a celebration of the LGBTQ community, but as a demonstration that they were still willing to fight for full equality. Over the past half century, pride events have evolved into events that are festive and exciting. Parades and floats and banners, music and dancing, and best of all, drag shows. Pride is indeed a time of celebration, but let us remember we could not have the celebration without the struggle. In June of 2019, a group in Boston who called themselves the Super Happy Fun America proved they were none of those things when they announced they were holding a straight pride parade. John Hugo, a co-sponsor of the event, was quoted as saying, "Perhaps one day straights will be honored with inclusion, and the acronym will be LGBTQS. Until that day, we have no other choice but to host our own event." Well, Mr. Hugo, the reason your event was a massive failure, with more counter-protesters showing up than actual parade marchers or supporters, is because you missed the entire point of what pride is. When we celebrate pride, we're not celebrating our sexual orientation or gender identity because we believe it's superior to yours. We're celebrating the progress we have made toward achieving equality. We're celebrating being able to say, I am lesbian, I am gay, I am bisexual, I am transgender, I am queer, without fear of being harassed, attacked, or fired from our jobs. We're celebrating full legal recognition of our families and marriages. We're celebrating an indomitable spirit that has survived centuries of hate and oppression. When straight people overcome having to hide who they are, when they have to fight for the right to be employed, adopt children, or be married, when straight people are expelled from churches, disowned by family members, and subjected by senseless violence based on their sexual orientation, then you get to have a parade, Mr. Hugo. Until then, you don't get to have the celebration until you've had the struggle. Pride is a continued struggle. We can celebrate pride today, and we have a right to celebrate. We went from being not allowed to serve in the military to don't ask, don't tell, to finally being allowed to openly serve. We've achieved marriage equality. In 2020, the Supreme Court ruled that the 1964 Civil Rights Act protects LGBTQ workers from discrimination. More importantly, attitudes have changed across the country. A study conducted by the Pew Research Center in 1989 showed that 89% of parents said they would be sad if one of their children were gay. By 2015, that number had dropped to 39%. But as members or allies of the LGBTQ community, let us not get so caught up in the parade of progress that we become complacent. We have come a long way, but we have not yet reached the promised land. Trans children have increasingly been the target of discriminatory legislation, banning them from using the restroom that aligns with their gender identity and banning them from competitive sports. A recent Texas law not only prohibits gender-affirming medical care for transgender youth, but depicts their parents and doctors as child abusers. Proponents of Florida's Don't Say Gay bill claim they are protecting elementary-age children from inappropriate lessons on gender identity and sexual orientation, but they either fail to recognize or refuse to admit that by banning the mention of specific groups of people at any grade level, they stigmatize those people. The intent of this legislation was not to protect children, but to reverse the trend toward acceptance of the LGBTQ community, using the propaganda of the past. Ron DeSantis' press secretary said the quiet part out loud when she tweeted, "If you're against the anti-grooming bill, you're probably a groomer, or at least you don't denounce the grooming of 4 to 8-year-old children." In a sermon preached at Sojourners United Church of Christ, in Charlottesville in 2019, Dr. Mimi Arvite said, "The origin of Pride Month is the 1969 Stonewall Uprising. Trans women of color fought back against police violence at the Stonewall Inn gay bar in New York. And that's the origin of what we honor each June. So Pride isn't just about coming out, it's about fighting back. It's about the acts of resistance that directly dismantle systems of oppression and liberate us and our loved ones. Pride is protest. Pride is experience. I must admit, I didn't always understand what pride meant. When I first came out, I saw pride merely as an event. Sadly, one we didn't have in my hometown of Charleston at the time. So when I moved to Savannah, I was excited to learn of Savannah's yearly celebration of Pride, which for some odd reason takes place in October rather than June. Nevertheless, on that October day, I left my apartment downtown and excitedly made my way to Forsyth Park, the epicenter of Savannah's Pride festivities. As I stopped at a crosswalk and waited for the walk sign, I noticed a family next to me who I could tell by their appearance were of the same faith tradition in which I was raised. "Are you Pentecostal?" I asked. As a side note, let me say, I know this sounds intrusive, but this is something Pentecostals do. When we see one another, we acknowledge it. I don't make the rules, but nonetheless, she acknowledged that she and her family were indeed Pentecostal, and she was delighted when I told her that I had been raised in a Pentecostal church. "Who's your pastor?" she asked curiously. "I haven't been to a Pentecostal church in years," I told her, "but when I did, I was the pastor." Disappointment swept the delight from her face as she asked sadly, "Well, what happened?" "Right now, I'm on my way to Gay Pride," I said. "Does that answer your question?" As the walk sign came on, she grabbed a hold of my hand and said to me, "The Holy Ghost is still real, and he can change you." I responded with a polite thank you as we parted ways. And then as I continued down Drayton Street, I experienced one of those moments in life. Those moments we all have sometimes when everything you wish you would have said, the perfect response comes to you after the situation has passed. I imagine myself responding, "The Holy Ghost can change me." Well, why didn't he? Why didn't he change me any one of the thousands of times that I begged for him to change me, to heal me, to fix me? When I was a young teenager struggling with feelings of self-loathing and depression, why didn't he change me then? Or when I convinced myself as a young adult that by marrying a good Christian girl would make me straight, why did he still not change me? Am I really to believe that the Holy Ghost was waiting not only until I had accepted who I was and begun to live honestly, but he was waiting for me to get 3 blocks away from my first gay pride, only to ruin my day by finally making me straight? And even if that were the case, and all the prayers I had sent up to heaven from my adolescence to age 27 had somehow gotten lost in the heavenly mail, only to finally arrive at the throne of God on this day, if God is holding out the magic pill I wanted for so many years that would make me straight, even if that were the case, my answer is thanks, but no thanks. It took a long time to get to know me, but now that I've met my true self, I like myself. I like my gay self. So no thanks. I don't want to be changed. That's what I would have said if only I'd thought of it in time. But I began to realize that I did give the right response to that well-intended but misguided Pentecostal woman on Drayton Street that day. Thank you was the right response, because in thinking about all the things I should have said to her, I was able to process everything I needed to say to myself. I experienced my first gay pride that day at Forsyth, but I realized pride was not an event. Pride is an experience. In many Spanish-speaking countries, the word mariposa, or butterfly, is a slang term for a gay man. I've always found this fascinating. So I asked some native Spanish speakers if the term is just slang or is it a slur? Although originally a pejorative expression, over time the word has been reclaimed by many gay men in Spanish-speaking countries. So whether it's offensive or not largely depends on who is saying it and why it is said. And while I want to be careful not to diminish the pain associated with this word to those who have been harmed and offended by its negative use, I must say of all the homophobic slurs I have heard and been called throughout my life, I love this one. If I'm walking down the street and someone yells, "Hey, you butterfly," my response is, "Thank you." There is no other insect that people will pay money to go into a room full of. A room full of flies, disgusting. A room full of roaches, horrifying. A room full of bees, deadly. A room full of butterflies, heavenly. Mariposa may have been intended as an insult, but I say it is a fitting tribute not only to gay men, but to all of the LGBTQ community. Like butterflies, we wrapped ourselves in layers of isolation we created to protect ourselves. And like butterflies, we outgrew our cocoon and broke forth from our shell, transformed into something of remarkable beauty, a beauty so tremendous that the world has no choice but to take notice. And like butterflies, there is no returning back to our cocoon. Pride is a celebration of spreading our wings and showing the world our splendor. Pride is saying to the world, we will never return to the days when we hid away in our cocoons. We simply don't fit there any longer. In October 2009, I traveled with my partner at the time to Washington, D.C. to be part of the National Equality March. It was a powerful event with speeches by political leaders, activists, and celebrities, Cynthia Nixon and Lady Gaga. But the most powerful part of the event for me occurred as the Washington, D.C. Gay Men's Chorus took the stage and began to singing Age of Aquarius. When they got to the part of the song where the beat changes and they sing, let the sunshine in, my then partner did something he had never done before. He reached over and held my hand. And as the march ended and we walked back to the metro station, he did so again. And from that point forward, for the rest of our relationship, whenever we walked together in public, whether in Washington, D.C. or Savannah, Georgia, we walked hand in hand. That may not be an earth-shattering milestone for equality, but for me, it was significant. It was pride. In closing, I'd like to read a portion of a poem entitled For Pride, written by UU minister Reverend Lois Van Leer. Underneath, there is a history, resistance. It was the marginalized of the marginalized. Drag queens, transvestites, the butch and the femme, who unlike Rosa Parks did not sit down, but in their tired rage stood up, rose up, fought back, holding the police captive in the bars they had come to raid. Their weapons, their oppression, their hands, beer bottles, Stonewall. 6 days of riot in New York, June 1969. A year later in March in Philadelphia, New York, a year later a march in Philadelphia, New York, Chicago, LA, San Fran, and now any weekend in June, anywhere around the world, pride. Why do we march? For those who are not able, for those who have been murdered, for those who are ravaged by disease, for those who are still beaten, still taunted, still harassed, still victims, still targets. Why do we march? Because some truths aren't self-evident, because all men ain't protected equal. and we love a good party. Thank you.